But let's first begin with some of the concepts of why nations fail, and also the economic origins of dictatorship and democracy, given what is happening with the Fed right now. Obviously, a lot of people are saying this is the DOJ subpoena of the Fed and of Jay Powell is another attack on potentially the independence of the Federal Reserve. How do you view this or do you view this as an attack on the independence of the Fed?
Oh, it's an attack into the integrity of institutions. Absolutely. Look, I mean, my research has been about institutions. Why is it that countries succeed or fail? It has a lot to do with institutions. Following rules, what kinds of rules you follow, who has power, how you constrain that power. No system is perfect.
So what happens when power is concentrated too much in the hands of an autocrat? I'm not saying Trump is an autocrat, but autocracy.
I think many people would. Many people would, but I think that's exactly the problem. Institutions are at their weakest when there is concentration of power. And for better or worse, many industrialized nations manage to avoid that concentration of power. What Trump is trying to do right now, what his administration is trying to do right now, is to build an imperial presidency with all powers concentrated in his hands. And the Fed, as well as some of the other agencies, are very important for the functioning of the U.S. economy. They're very important for the health of the U.S. economy. The secret source of U.S. economy has been its institutional success. It's courts, its agencies. That's what's about to collapse right now.
How do you think Trump has been able to sort of upend presidential protocols with his slew of executive orders, bypassing Congress, and other aspects of what a quote-unquote authoritarian leader might employ? How has he been able to do that with those institutions in place to keep the checks and balances in place?
Well, that has so many answers. I mean, one is unless Congress if the Congress had not allowed him to do it, he wouldn't be able to do it. So the fact that the Republican-led Congress has essentially given up its responsibility is very important. But in a big picture, you have to understand U.S. institutions have been in a crisis for quite a while now. And Trump himself is an agent of deepening that crisis, but he's also continuing the response to that crisis. It wasn't just Trump, it was before him Bush, then even worse Obama, and then even worse Biden, who also passed many, many executive orders trying to bypass agencies, Congress, courts, and that's actually already a symptom of something going wrong. But Trump is really trying to destroy the norms that sustain U.S. institutions and weaken all sorts of powers, including some very important like the Fed.
So it's building sort of de facto power as well by placing loyalists in positions where they answer to him.
100%. And when you actually appoint loyalists, especially unqualified loyalists, it is two birds with one stone. First of all, you have people who are beholden to you, but second, you're actually changing the norm. You're weakening the norms that make these agencies work as independent, mission-driven. People are proud to be part of the Fed because it's independent. It's really upholding the right sort of monetary policy. You destroy that. Once you destroy that, the entire monetary policy is responsible to you, and you've put your loyalists in there. The same thing with the FBI, the same thing with the Department of Justice. So it's a big erosion of what we have believed in as U.S. institutions.
Will these efforts work over the longer term, or will it backfire?
Well, in many countries they have, but for them to really work, they really need to also destroy electoral processes. So I think Trump is not strong enough to sideline elections in the midterms or in the next general election.
He's floated the idea.
But I don't think he's strong enough. He's getting there, but right now he's not strong enough. So I think voters have to really show that this is not what they want. What happens in the midterms is going to matter a lot. I think at the end of the day, it's the voters, it's the citizens who have to defend democratic institutions. What happened in South Korea is very inspiring. The South Korean president tried to do an accelerated version of the same thing, and voters said no.
Let's, if I can talk to the producer right now, bring up the full screen quote of what Donald Trump told the New York Times in an interview. Essentially, he's saying he's only constrained by his own morality. My mind is the only thing that can stop me. That does not sound like the words of a US president. Is this, regardless of whether Trump succeeds or not, has this changed the dynamic of the US presidency forever?
Well, again, I think you have to see that as a process. It's been going more and more in that direction. But indeed, I think when anybody says they are just constrained by their morality, you know that their morality is not strong enough to constrain them. Because if you really want to be constrained, there are all sorts of institutions. You should strengthen them, not weaken them. Trump has done his best to weaken media, to weaken Congress, to weaken the courts, to weaken bureaucracies. So, no, he's not going to be constrained by his morality.
In your most recent book, Power and Progress, which I can pivot now to some of your thoughts on AI, which also brings into the fold democracy as well, you're fairly critical of how AI is being developed and eventually will be employed, whether there's the anti-worker or the pro-worker. You don't think necessarily that this is at all the way it's going so far good for the worker, and actually has a negative impact on jobs, wages, and democracy.
Absolutely.
How so?
Look, I am not an AI pessimist. I think AI is an amazing technology. It has great promise. But we call it artificial intelligence, and we forget what type of intelligence. If you think of what AI can do, humans cannot do that. Dealing with huge data sets, finding patterns. What humans can do, make quick decisions, quick generalizations, AI cannot do. These are very different things. When you have two different things, the right way is to combine them, to make them complement to each other. You and I are different, we can work together.
Sure.
But what the industry is trying to do is to, under this sort of banner of artificial general intelligence, use AI as an automation technology, replicate what humans do rather than complement what humans do. Automation technologies are not good for workers because they displace workers. They may have other benefits, they may improve productivity, they may then create other jobs, but they're not directly good. But as complementary technologies could create a lot of benefits. But we're not doing that, we're failing at that.
So again, in China, they like to talk about AI as a tool for increasing productivity. But again, to your point, when you go and look at the factories that I've been to, many of them across China, a lot of them are highly, highly automated. There may be one employee, human employee, to multitudes of robots and industrial arms. So what does that tell you about whether there is a bifurcation of the end result of AI? In the US, some say it's greed by the big corporations. China likes to frame it as a tool for productivity. But do you think it's still going to be the end result, and that is anti-worker?
Well, I think there are some differences. I think the most important one is that China is going to have a big labor shortage coming up. So it is a little bit more natural for China to start investing in automation.
Yeah.
And that, the Chinese population is going to halve in the next 50 years or 60 years. That's just enormous. No country has experienced anything like that. The kind of the upheaval that this will create for the labor market is huge. So I think automation has to be part of what China does. And I think automation, I'm not against automation. I think automation is great. We can get rid of some meaningless jobs. But you have to do other things as well. China, until now, has had a lot of faults when it comes to AI, as well as authoritarianism. But until recently, China was using AI more like a tool. But the sort of the AGI, artificial general intelligence bug, is now transmitted from the US to China. So China is now playing in this AGI game as well, which I think is a losing proposition at the end.
Now, I don't mean to put you on the spot about your comments about China, but from 3 years ago, or now 4 years ago, in 2022, you wrote an op-ed piece, China's economy is rotting from the head. I think that was the title. You said, as true in all autocracies, no independent experts or domestic media will speak up about the train wreck Xi Jinping has set in motion. Obviously, China is very confident that it has set itself in the correct direction. Have you changed your thesis on China, or is it still the fact that it's an autocracy with no independent institutions is going to eventually drag it down?
I think eventually it's going to create problems, but there are two things. First of all, China-US comparison, China looks much better now because US is destroying itself. So the China-US comparison,
so by default,
my default is very different than what I would have said 5-6 years ago. Not that I was very confident about the US institutions. There were many problems 5-6 years ago, but they are looking much worse per the conversation you and I had. Second, China has been very good at mobilizing its engineering talent.
Yes.
that engineering talent has carried it very far. But despite those distortions and limitations that a top-down system imposes. So it's a race in some sense. Can Chinese engineering save Chinese AI and Chinese industry?
Yes.
Or ultimately it's going to be subject to the same constraints, it's going to get stuck in some dead end.
Just to pivot back before we wrap up back to the United States, can democracy and the democratic institutions save the moves that are afoot right now to sort of erode that?
Yes, they can, but there's no guarantee. I think the great thing about democracy is that it is a continuous process. It reinvents itself. Look at the US, for example, during the progressive era. Things looked like very, very terrible. It was an oligarchy that controlled politics, wealth was becoming very concentrated, monopolies ruled everything, and then suddenly 10 years later, the US looks completely different. But the bad thing about democracy is that there isn't a recipe for this kind of change. It sometimes can get stuck. And right now I'm worried we're stuck, but this is not time to give up hope.